we were slowly moving down Greenview Street, passing by the cozy little houses that adorned this small town. Behind the wheel of our car was Sheriff Tom Harding, my boss. He was lost in his thoughts, his gaze fixed on the road, and nothing could distract him. I had only recently arrived in Elmwood, and my first day in this new place was memorable thanks to meeting Tom. Back then, this 45-year-old man with a beard reached out his hand, smiled warmly, and shook mine like a fatherly figure. Without hesitation, he appointed me as his deputy, and we immediately got down to fulfilling our duties. Elmwood turned out to be so small that it could be called more of a large village than a town. Located on the edge of a vast forest at the foot of a majestic mountain range, it was an oasis of tranquility and safety. Crime here was rare, and the tight-knit and friendly community of residents created an atmosphere of cozy neighborliness, where everyone knew each other by name. Leaving behind the cozy neighborhood, our car smoothly rolled onto the highway. Fields surrounded us on both sides, stretching to the horizon, creating a sense of boundless freedom and space. Golden and green waves of grain swayed under the gentle summer breeze, like the sea under the soft caress of the wind. In the distance, against the blue sky, rose the silhouettes of mountains, lending grandeur and completeness to the landscape. As we progressed along the highway, we left behind the hustle and bustle of the town, immersing ourselves in the tranquility and peace that only nature can provide. Soon, a farm began to loom on the horizon, becoming clearer with each mile we passed. When we arrived, we were greeted by a well-maintained piece of land where picturesque landscapes and hard-working human labor harmoniously coexisted. Miller's Farm was an example of rural idyll. A majestic two-story house with white walls and a red roof proudly stood against the backdrop of green fields, while nearby were neat outbuildings, a barn, a chicken coop, and a cattle shed. Flower beds were arranged around the house, adding colorful accents to the overall picture, and rows of neatly trimmed shrubs adorned the paths leading to the house. In the backyard, a small lake was visible, adorned with a gazebo, the perfect place for family relaxation. As we approached the house, the sounds of life on the farm became clearer. The chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, and even the distant mooing of a cow created a cozy atmosphere. We parked the car at the porch, and as we got out, we headed towards the front door of the house. Climbing the creaky steps of the porch, we went upstairs and knocked on the door, expecting to meet the owners of this beautiful place. Soon the door opened, and a woman in her 50s appeared on the threshold. Her hair, interspersed with silver threads, was neatly gathered into a bun. Her face, with soft wrinkles around her eyes and lips, expressed kindness and hospitality. She was dressed in a simple but neat dress, adorned with an apron. Recognizing us, she warmly greeted us, and then turned and loudly called out inside the house, inviting her husband. In a moment, a man of about 55 appeared before us. His posture exuded strength and confidence, typical of someone who has spent most of their life outdoors. His face was adorned with a neatly trimmed beard of gray hair, and his gaze was penetrating and friendly. He wore a worn-out flannel shirt and jeans. "Hello, Tom," he greeted the sheriff. Then he shook his hand, after which he looked at me and said, "And this must be your new deputy. Hello, my name is John." He extended his hand, which I shook. "My name is Michael," I replied, to which the old man nodded. Then he casually turned to the sheriff. "How are things in town?" "Everything was quiet until an old ruin disturbed me. Tell me what happened to you," the sheriff replied with a smile. "You know, I wouldn't have bothered you if it weren't for something serious. My best cow has gone missing. She used to give me up to 13 gallons of milk a day. "It's such a pity she's gone. A big loss for us," the owner said with sadness in his voice. After a short pause, he added, "Well, let me show you where it happened." After his words, the farm owner led us to the spacious pen where about 50 cows grazed. Approaching the wooden fence, he pointed to the spot where the ground was disturbed, forming numerous tracks, and one of the fence beams was clearly damaged. "I suspect the thief got through this gap. In the summer, I leave the cows overnight in this pen. It's always been quiet here, and I've never worried about their safety. But look at this," John said, pointing to the damage. "Despite the break, I can't understand how someone could have taken such a large cow through this fence. The locks on the gates weren't tampered with, and if it were wild animals, there would be blood stains. But I found nothing like that." We carefully examined the scene of the incident, but it was impossible to determine who left these tracks. The ground was simply churned up, leaving no distinct shapes. After that, we conducted a survey of the area. Walking around the fence, we began to search for clues beyond its limits, but we couldn't find anything suspicious. In search of evidence, we decided to split up to cover more ground. The pen was located near the forest, and I headed towards the dense greenery, hoping to find some traces there. Soon my search was interrupted by Sheriff Harding's voice, calling out to me and waving his hand to beckon me over. Approaching closer, I noticed that his attention was focused on the ground. Bending down over the earth, Sheriff Harding carefully examined a huge footprint. Despite its blurry outlines, the print bore a striking resemblance to a human one, except for its abnormal size, about 15 inches in length. I, struck by such a sight, couldn't take my eyes off it, trying to understand how and who could have left it here. Meanwhile, the sheriff remained calm and focused, as if encountering such a thing was not new to him. He pulled out his smartphone and began to meticulously photograph the footprint from different angles, then took out a ruler and measured it. 15.5 inches, he muttered to himself, carefully jotting down the data in his notebook. Unable to contain my curiosity, I asked him what creature could have left such a footprint. The sheriff looked up at me and replied with a hint of skepticism in his voice, "It's not certain yet that it's a creature. There are plenty of pranksters in our country capable of such things, so it's too early to draw any conclusions." I nodded in agreement. Continuing our search for some time, we still couldn't find any additional evidence or clues that could shed light on the disappearance of the miller's cow. Feeling the weight of the moment, we returned to the farm to inform the Millers of the current status of the investigation. With sadness, but also understanding that everything possible had been done, we assured them that we would continue the search. The Millers thanked us for our efforts despite the lack of results. Then we headed to the neighboring farm, hoping that its inhabitants might have noticed something unusual or suspicious. However, after a series of questions, it became clear that nothing had been observed there that could be related to our case. The farm residents answered us in the negative, not hiding their surprise at what had happened. With this new information, but without additional evidence, we returned to the station. The journey back was filled with reflections on what other steps could be taken to solve this mystery. At the station, we had work to do in organizing the collected data and planning further actions. So passed the remainder of the day. I was awakened by the ringing of the phone. On the other end of the line was Sheriff Harding. His voice was subdued, but urgency was evident. "Get dressed and head to the address I'm sending you right now." Glancing at the clock, I saw that it was only 5 in the morning. Approaching the window, I noticed how the sky was slowly brightening, heralding a new day. Without delay, I quickly washed my face and dressed, trying to gather my thoughts and imagine what could require our attention so early. Starting the car, I headed to the address provided by the sheriff. Upon arrival, I found myself in front of a small house, cozily situated on the edge of the forest. It was a one-story building with wooden walls. The roof of the house was covered with shingles, some of which were moss-covered, indicating many years of its life next to the forest. Around the house, there was a small but well-kept garden. As I arrived, I saw that Sheriff Harding had also just arrived. He was slowly getting out of his patrol car parked nearby. His figure stood out against the morning light beginning to filter through the dense foliage of the forest. As I stepped out of my car, he nodded towards the door. There stood a woman and a man. She was clearly distraught, crying while he tried to comfort her, embracing her shoulders. Approaching them, we became witnesses to their distress. The woman, barely noticing us, rushed towards us and pleaded anxiously, "Please find Bill." Sheriff Harding tried to reassure her. "Ma'am, please explain everything step by step. We're here to help you." She carefully wiped away her tears and, stuttering with excitement, began to explain. "I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know. Maybe it was a premonition or something, but I couldn't sleep. I went out of my bedroom and decided to check on Bill, but when I looked into his room, he wasn't there. I panicked immediately and started looking for him, but he wasn't in the house. Together with Josh, we searched the entire house and yard, then expanded the search to the surroundings, but Bill was nowhere to be found." As she said this, tears overwhelmed her again. Sheriff Harding, displaying patience, gave her some time to calm down a bit before asking the next question. "Ma'am, was the front door locked? Did you check?" The woman hesitated for a moment, then shook her head, admitting, "No, it seems it wasn't locked." The sheriff and I exchanged glances, then asked for permission to inspect the house. After examining the boy's bedroom and the front door, we concluded that there were no signs of forced entry. Informing the parents of this, we speculated that Bill might have left the house on his own and gotten lost. We considered this initial version the most likely, and decided not to mention the possibility of abduction to avoid worsening the parents' anxiety further. After realizing the scale of the problem, we contacted the precinct requesting assistance. We also reached out to neighbors, quickly forming a search party to meticulously comb the surroundings. Starting our search near the house at the edge of the forest, I stumbled upon a child's toy. It seemed to have been forgotten in haste or dropped in flight. Summoning Sheriff Harding, we inspected the nearby area together and soon stumbled upon a trail that couldn't go unnoticed. It was again that same enormous footprint we had seen before. The sheriff, upon seeing it, froze for a moment, then squatted beside it, lighting a cigarette, lost in thought. After a short pause, he stood up and, addressing me, instructed to document the find. Then, as if deciding something for himself, he plunged into the woods. I carefully documented the location of the toy and the footprint, taking photographs and notes in my notebook. Thoughts of what could have happened to Bill and what creature left this track haunted me. After about 20 minutes, Sheriff Harding returned from the woods, looking pensive. After a brief pause, as if gathering his thoughts, he shook himself and motioned for me to come closer. Issuing orders for the remaining colleagues to continue the search, he and I got into the patrol car and headed in a direction unknown to me. When I asked where we were going, the sheriff replied that we needed to visit someone. I didn't fully understand how this was related to our current investigation, but I nodded in understanding and decided not to ask unnecessary questions. Apparently, the sheriff had in mind someone who could help us find the missing boy or shed light on the mysterious tracks we had discovered earlier. We drove along a road running alongside dense forest. With each mile, the trees seemed denser, their branches sometimes arching over the road, creating the illusion of a tunnel pierced by the rays of the morning sun. The forest filled the air with freshness and subtle scents of earth and vegetation, particularly noticeable in the early hours of the day. Suddenly, the sheriff turned onto a narrow dirt road leading us deeper into the woods. The road wound its way between the trees, and with each turn, it seemed we were delving further into the Green Kingdom. After driving about half a mile along this almost forgotten trail, we approached a house nestled amidst the forest. The house was entirely ordinary, as much as possible in such a secluded place. It was a single-story building with a low roof covered in dark brown tiles, which blended well with the surrounding nature. The walls of the house were painted in a serene shade, which had peeled off in places, showing signs of time and weathering. Around the house sprawled a small plot of land, adorned with wildflowers and grasses, lending the place a special secluded coziness. In front of the house, engulfed in the greenery of the forest, we were greeted by a man in jeans and no shirt, busy chopping wood. Next to him stood an old pickup truck, from which loud rock music blared, filling the surrounding space with energy and rhythm. Despite our arrival, the man showed no interest and continued his work, as if we were mere shadows on his land. After we parked the car and got out, we stood at a distance, not wanting to intrude on his personal space, and waited. Minutes passed slowly until the man finished his work. Noticing us, he approached the pickup truck and turned off the music, thus interrupting the stream of sounds that had filled the air until then. After a short moment of silence, Chris addressed us. "Sheriff Harding, what do I owe the pleasure of your attention?" "Hello, Chris," replied the sheriff, his tone serious but friendly. "We need your help. It's urgent." Chris, slightly surprised by such an address, responded, "Help, you say? But as you can see, I'm busy," waving his hand towards the chopped wood. "This concerns the disappearance of a child, and it perhaps involves it," continued the sheriff, as if choosing each word carefully. The sheriff's words made Chris flinch, and he asked questioningly, "Sasquatch?" To which the sheriff nodded. This confirmation instantly changed Chris's attitude towards the conversation. His interest clearly piqued and excited by the news, he said, "Well, why didn't you say so right away? Come in." And he led us into the house. As we stepped inside, I was greatly astonished. The walls were adorned with various trophies, from huge deer and bears to more exotic ones, as if taken from the pages of books about unknown creatures. Among them were replicas of stuffed mythical beasts, each with its own plaque. In addition to the trophies, the walls were adorned with antique maps and photographs from his numerous expeditions, where Chris was captured in various corners of the world, from snowy mountains to dense tropical forests. On the shelves were books on cryptozoology, scientific papers, and hunting magazines, as well as collections of rare minerals and artifacts found during his travels. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table cluttered with maps, compasses, night vision cameras, and other equipment for exploring the unknown. On one of the shelves, attention was drawn to a meticulously crafted model of Bigfoot, surrounded by Chris's notes and records about presumed places of its habitat. After Sheriff Harding shared the details of our investigation with Chris and showed him photographs of the huge footprints, the hunter paused for a moment, studying the images with a serious expression. His gaze kept shifting between the photos and the sheriff, as if he was trying to piece together all the details of the story in his mind. Finally, he spoke up. "We might have to spend a few days in the woods. so we'll need to pack supplies and a tent." Upon hearing these words, Chris immediately began gathering supplies. He moved around the house with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what he needs. First, he went to the pantry, from where he brought several packets of dried food, bottles of water, and other necessary provisions for survival in the wilderness. Then he headed to the gear closet, where sleeping bags, a camping stove, flashlights, batteries, and a multitude of other items essential for extended stays in the forest were stored. Chris also didn't forget about safety. He took a first aid kit, a map of the area, and a compass, as well as his reliable hunting rifle in case of encounters with wild animals. He carefully packed all of this into a large backpack and additional bags. Once Chris finished preparing, he meticulously loaded all the necessary supplies and equipment into our car. With everything now on board, we were fully prepared for the upcoming expedition into the depths of the forest. Arriving at the house where the child went missing, we found that the search efforts were still ongoing. Officer Harris approached us, informing that there were still no positive results. Sheriff Harding, seemingly prepared for such news, nodded as if expecting such an outcome. He explained to the officer that we were going into the woods for a couple of days of search and instructed them not to cease the search operation around the house and to keep us updated with any news. Then we headed towards the edge of the forest where the track left by the unidentified creature was found. Chris squatted beside the track, beginning to study it carefully. He looked for any signs that could help us understand the creature's direction of movement or behavior. After a brief analysis, we entered the forest, ready for extensive searching. As we made our way through dense vegetation, we continued our journey deeper into the forest. Chris, leading our small group, tirelessly scrutinized the surroundings, searching for any signs of the cryptid's presence. He seemed completely absorbed in the search process, his eyes not missing the slightest detail. The biggest challenge in detecting cryptids is that they can either erase their tracks or simply don't leave any. Chris mused aloud, peering into the shadows between the trees. I don't know if it's their natural or supernatural ability, but following their tracks is extremely difficult. But the one we're following did leave some clues. His words added a sense of mystique and uncharted territory to our journey. Soon, our persistence was rewarded. We discovered a second clear track left by the creature. It was as gigantic as the previous one, and unmistakably indicated that we were moving in the right direction. As we trudged through the forest, our path occasionally led us to clearings bathed in bright sunlight, and then into thickets of dense shrubbery where sunlight barely penetrated through the dense canopy of trees. The forest trail meandered, constantly forcing us to adjust our direction based on the tracks found. Chris, leading our small group, carefully scanned the surroundings for new evidence. At one point, we veered off course and had to backtrack after realizing our mistake. Soon, our path led us to another obvious trace left by the creature. It confirmed that we were heading in the right direction. However, our progress was suddenly halted by an unpleasant discovery. On one of the forest clearings, we found the carcass of a dead bear. The animal lay on the ground, its head missing. It had been severed with such force and precision that it instantly sent shivers down our spines. There were no signs of struggle or other traces around the carcass. Everything looked as if the attack had occurred suddenly. We stopped to examine the scene. Chris cautiously circled the bear's carcass, trying to find any clues that could help us understand what had happened. The heavy stench of death hung in the air, mixing with the natural scents of the forest, creating a strange and unsettling feeling. I still couldn't believe what was happening. At first, it seemed to me that it was all not serious, and the sheriff might be looking for imitators of this creature. But seeing this carcass made me feel uneasy, and doubts began to creep into my mind. After a thorough examination of the bear's carcass, we continued our journey deeper into the forest. The sun began to slowly descend towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, heralding the onset of evening. Realizing that daylight was coming to an end, we began to look for a suitable place to camp for the night. Soon we found an open patch of land that was perfect for setting up camp. This spot was fairly level and situated on a rise, providing good visibility of the surrounding area and protection from potential runoff. Without delay, we pitched our tent, creating a cozy shelter for the night. Then we gathered twigs and dry branches for a campfire. As darkness fell, the fire crackled to life, casting a warm light on our tired faces and creating a sense of coziness and safety amidst the vast forest. Several stones were arranged around the fire, on which we placed our simple dinners of dry rations and canned food warmed over the flames. Sitting by the fire, we quietly ate our dinners, enjoying the relative calmness and warmth of the fire. Around us, the sounds of the nocturnal forest could be heard. The rustle of leaves, the calls of nocturnal birds, and the distant howling of wolves. Sitting by the fire, enveloped in the darkness and silence of the night forest, I decided to learn more about the mysterious creatures that could be lurking in its depths. "How long have you been searching for this creature?" I asked Chris. For a moment, Chris seemed lost in distant memories before giving an answer. "It started back in childhood," he began. "There were always legends about Bigfoot in our town, and those stories always fascinated me. Once, when I was young and perhaps quite foolish, I decided to venture into the woods in search of it." Chris smiled, reminiscing about his youthful adventure, but his eyes remained serious. "I got lost. They searched for me for a whole week. During that time, I survived in the forest, feeding on berries and nuts. One night, I thought I saw a figure. At first, I thought it was help, but upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't human. The figure was huge and gray. It seemed to notice me and glanced around. I managed to hide in dense bushes. The creature approached, surveyed the area, but finding nothing, disappeared." His voice sounded tense, recalling that moment of fear and bewilderment. "I sat trembling in the bushes, and after that encounter, I couldn't forget it. They found me, and I told the story, but of course no one believed me." He sighed tiredly and pulled out a flask from his pocket, offering me whiskey. Declining the offer, I watched as he took a few sips and continued. "So when you came to me today and showed the tracks, I was so excited. I've been looking for evidence of their existence for so long, and after all these years, it has manifested itself again." We sat in silence, absorbed in his story. Chris's story ended when suddenly a noise came from the bushes, making us turn sharply. My heart raced faster as I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it towards the suspicious sounds. We approached slowly, the piercing light of the flashlight sliding over the bushes until it illuminated something gray and massive hidden among the foliage. For a moment I froze, trying to understand what was before me. As the flashlight rose higher, it revealed a huge, hairy face with fangs, reminiscent of a monkey. The creature met us with the fiery gaze of its eyes and grinned horribly. Instinctively, I reached for my gun, and at that moment the creature swiftly disappeared into the night forest. We chased after it, but it vanished without a trace. Standing in the complete silence of the night forest, I turned to the sheriff and said, trying to contain the tremor in my voice, "Boss, it really exists. It exists." After thoroughly inspecting the surroundings and finding no more clues, we realized that chasing it on such a night was a bad idea. Deciding to wait until morning, we returned to the campfire, but sleep hardly came to me that night. At dawn, we resumed our search. With the first rays of sunlight bathing the forest in its warm light, the events of the night before seemed distant and almost unreal. But the further we progressed along the trail, the clearer it became that we had encountered something inexplicable and very real. Discussing what had happened, we tried to find a logical explanation, but every option seemed unconvincing. Soon we came upon a dense thicket stretching for miles ahead, leading to rocky mountain ridges towering on the horizon. It was clear that our path lay through this thicket, which was so dense that direct sunlight could not penetrate through its thickets, shrouding everything in semi-darkness. We stopped at the entrance to the thicket, looking into its dark depths with a sense of nervousness and fear. This place might not seem so scary if it weren't for yesterday's encounter with the unknown. Fear of the unknown, reinforced by our fresh memories, made us think twice before entering this dark place. Chris told us that he had explored this forest many times before but had never seen this place, which was strange. After exchanging glances one last time, full of determination and readiness for the unknown, we stepped into the dense thicket. The initial silence of the forest instilled a sense of calmness, and we cautiously moved forward, peering into the surrounding nature and anticipating an encounter with the unknown. But soon the atmosphere began to change as we stumbled upon animal skeletons and scattered bones, strangely missing skulls. This detail seemed particularly alarming to me, creating the impression that we were not just in the forest, but in some sinister trap or even a graveyard. Continuing our search, hoping to find any trace of the child, we came across a small boot forgotten amidst tall grass. This discovery suddenly gave us a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the child was still alive and our search was not in vain. However, with each step deeper into the forest, the bones became more numerous, as if we were walking through a silent graveyard of animals, each of which had contributed to this grim landscape. Our attention was drawn to the unpleasant smell of decay, which grew stronger as we approached. Gathering our courage, we headed towards the source of the stench, and soon found a decaying cow carcass among the rocks. The area around it was swarming with flies, whose buzzing created a grim symphony of death. With a high probability, it was Miller's missing cow. Without a word, we left the place, eager to get away from the unbearable stench and the grim thoughts it evoked. We continued our journey, keeping in mind the image of the found boot as a reminder that our search was not over yet. A sense of unease and urgency grew with each step, urging us forward through the dense greenery and the secrets that this ancient forest held. As we ventured further into the forest, in one of the small clearings hidden among the trees, we stumbled upon something resembling a shrine or altar. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone, on which strange symbols and imprints resembling huge footprints were laid out. Surrounding the stone, as if guarding it, were skulls of various sizes, from small animals to those belonging to large mammals. Among them was one object that caught our special interest and awe. A large skull, whose shape resembled that of a human, but its size and some features were so unusual that it could not be attributed to any known species. Along one side of the clearing, long branches and sticks were neatly arranged, forming something akin to a wall or barrier, each of which was wrapped in hairs and fabrics, differing in texture and color from those of the ordinary forest animals. These hairs seemed rough and thick, as if they belonged to a creature whose existence we could only guess at. Next to the altar lay several large stones arranged in a certain order, forming a shape reminiscent of a star or compass. On one of the stones were engraved images depicting silhouettes of creatures similar to what we had seen last night. Hairy, massive figures with sharp fangs. As we carefully examined the altar, trying to decipher the meaning of these mysterious objects, a sudden fierce roar from behind made us turn sharply. But where we expected to see the source of the sound, there was no one. The creature skillfully concealed itself in the dense thicket, leaving us in tension and uncertainty. Instantly drawing our weapons, we tried to remain vigilant when a sharp sound came from the other side. Either the same beast was incredibly fast, or there were several of them. We stood back to back, preparing for a possible attack from any direction. The creature moved with incredible speed, allowing us to see only fleeting silhouettes in the semi-darkness of the forest. Suddenly, huge boulders, threatening to crush us upon impact, began to fly towards us from an unknown direction. Dodging these deadly projectiles became a real challenge. Suddenly, the sheriff opened fire, and without hesitation we joined in the shooting. But our bullets seemed to either miss the target or be powerless against this creature, which continued to unleash its stone fury upon us. As we tried to dodge, one of the stones struck Chris's arm with such force that the bones were instantly broken and he fell to the ground screaming in pain. We rushed to his aid, helping him up. At that moment, the sheriff shouted, "Run! We need to run!" We ran. The sheriff supported the hunter, and I covered their rear, shooting at the pursuing creature. The shots and cries of the beast merged in the chaos of the chase. As we retreated, I continued to shoot until I noticed that my companions had disappeared from sight. In panic, I began to look around for them when suddenly a powerful blow knocked me off my feet, and I lost consciousness, plunging into dreamless darkness. When I came to, a 6-year-old boy stood over me. It was Bill, the boy we had desperately been searching for. His presence filled me with relief, which quickly turned to bewilderment as I tried to understand where we were. Looking around, I realized that we were in a dungeon, a room with a low ceiling enclosed by a cage made of logs. Peering outside, I understood that we were in a cave, and our cell was just one of its many recesses. On the floor lay the skin of a beast. I looked at the child. He was trembling all over and terrified. Approaching him, I hugged him, trying to reassure him and promising that we would escape, although inside I doubted my words. Calming down, the boy soon fell asleep and I gently laid him on the skin, pondering how long he could have been sleeping in safety. After making sure that Bill was safe, I turned my attention to the grate, trying to find a way to open it. Discovering a mechanism with a peg, I futilely tried to pull it out, realizing that without the right tool, I couldn't manage it. Looking into the depths of the cave, I saw numerous skulls scattered around the room, and in the center, the fresh carcass of a deer. This sight filled the air of the cave with a terrifying atmosphere. Suddenly, the creature entered the cave, huge, covered in gray fur. Its heavy breathing filled the space as it approached the deer carcass, tore off its leg, and began to chew on the raw meat. Noticing us, the creature glanced in our direction. I held my breath as it approached our cage. I stepped back to the other end, trying to keep as much distance between us as possible. The creature looked truly terrifying. Its small eyes stared at me intently, studying. Then, unexpectedly, it threw the remains of the meat through the bars, and then retreated into the depths of the cave. As soon as the creature left the cave, silence fell, giving us hope of rescue. I tried to use this moment to find a way out of the cage, pulling on the bars one by one in search of the weakest link. Despite all efforts, success eluded me until suddenly a noise was heard from outside. To my surprise and relief, the sheriff managed to enter the cave. He gestured for silence and quickly inspected the cage. Seeing the peg, he forcefully knocked it out with his boot, thus opening the door. I quickly grabbed the child, and we cautiously stepped out into the cave. The sheriff waved me to follow him. We silently made our way through the cave, and I couldn't help but look around. Everywhere there was an eerie feeling of abandonment and danger. In one corner, my attention was drawn to the skeletons of people, scattered around the corners of the cave. This sight filled me with fear and realization of how dangerous this creature could be. I understood that we were not just dealing with a myth or legend. Before us was a real threat, capable of horrifying deeds. Navigating through the dark corridors of the cave, we tried to move as quietly as possible to avoid attracting the creature's attention. Every rustle, every unexpected sound made us freeze. But under the sheriff's guidance, who either knew the cave plan well or was just lucky in finding the way out, we continued our quiet progress towards freedom. When we heard distant roars, the sheriff hurriedly urged us not to pay attention and quicken our pace. A shot into the air he fired after his words was probably a signal to Chris, who was distracting the creature from us at that moment. We ran hastily. The cave was in the mountains, so we had to descend a steep slope before reaching familiar foliage. We didn't look back, trying to cast aside all fears, although the sounds of roars echoed from afar. When I asked the sheriff if we would wait for Chris, he replied that they had agreed to meet near our camp. I nodded and we continued to run, not looking back, afraid that the creature might be following us. This continued until we reached our camp, where we spent the night. Stopping, we began to wait for Chris. As evening fell, we decided not to light a fire to avoid unnecessary attention. As darkness fell, we grouped together trying to keep warm. Suddenly we heard rustling in the bushes. I instantly drew my pistol, preparing for the worst as the rustling continued, making us strain to peer into the darkness. And suddenly, a figure emerged from the bushes. It was Chris. We breathed a sigh of relief and hurried to embrace him, rejoicing at his return. But his gaze was troubled. He kept looking back. With a worried expression, he said that we needed to leave urgently. His words filled the air with a sense of urgency, and we quickly gathered our belongings, preparing for further escape from the threat that still seemed to lurk in the shadows of the night forest. In the dark of the night forest, it seemed as if nature itself held its breath, awaiting the outcome of our mad escape. The sheriff, Chris, and I, with Bill in my arms, dashed through the darkness, carving a path between the trees, whose shadows seemed like huge sentinels of this ominous world. Every step on the soft forest moss seemed to produce sounds louder than thunderclaps, and our hearts beat in unison with the frantic rhythm of the chase. The sounds coming from the depths of the forest filled the air with a sense of impending doom. The roar of a creature born from the very shadows shattered the night, reminding us of the closeness of the danger that sought to engulf us. We didn't know how far this monster was pursuing us, but every rustle behind us made us speed up, as if death itself breathed down our necks. The air was filled with cold and dampness, and the branches of the trees, like dead fingers, tried to grab us, slowing our pace. In the forest, devoid of light, pitch darkness made our imagination paint the most terrifying pictures, giving every shadow the form of our pursuer. Each shot fired by the sheriff into the night in hopes of repelling the creature only heightened the feeling of hopelessness, adding elements of a cruel survival game to our escape. We didn't know if we would manage to escape this unknown threat, but we understood. Stopping meant the end. Making our way through the thicket, experiencing the weight of the night terror, we suddenly saw light ahead. It was a ray of hope in the endless darkness of our despair. Joyfully, we ran towards it, each step bringing us closer to salvation. And soon, before us lay the miller's farm, the very same farm we had visited before. With the sheriff and Chris, despite exhaustion and injuries, we quickly approached the farm. Seeing the familiar paddock, the sheriff leaped over it first, then helped Chris, and finally I handed him the child before jumping over the fence myself. Looking back one last time, I noticed a figure standing in the shadows of the trees, staring at us. Indicating to my companions, we all stared at this mysterious entity together. For a moment the world stood still, and we stood facing each other, separated by darkness and uncertainty. Then the huge figure, whose presence filled us with horror, disappeared into the depths of the forest. With relief, we exhaled, allowing ourselves to take a deep breath for the first time in a long time. The events of this night would stay with us forever, like a heavy dream from which we wanted to wake up. We headed towards the miller's house in search of shelter and rest after the exhausting flight. Looking back one last time at the sinister darkness of the forest, I silently wished myself and my companions that we would never again encounter that creature that tried to engulf us. This forest seemed to hold many secrets, but some of them were better left unsolved.